And then I'm going to mute everybody, and hopefully you'll be able to chime in when you want to. And then I'm going to share my screen. All right, there we go. All right. This banner over. Let's see. How do I do that? All right. Hopefully you can see my screen. Can somebody chime in and let me know if you can unmute yourself?
Hello.
Ah, yeah, there we go. I hear you. Hopefully we won't have that issue again. Well, what we're going to talk about today is the Bevel and Emboss. And I've created a couple of little things here that we can work with. And this is nothing more than just RTPC. And basically, I came in here and created some layers with these letters on it and just kind of put them together. So, and then I flattened it and created a layer where they're all together so I can create them as a single event like that. So now we have this and we can start working with the Bevel and Emboss. So there's a couple ways, as you probably know, to get to your blending option. You can either click on the little FX down here, or you can double click here. And I think you can probably right click over here and go to it somehow. But my shortcut is always just to come over here and double click, and it opens it up. And the difference between doing it that way and doing it this way is you can go directly to where you want to go. Whereas if you do double click here, you have to actually go and click on what you want to work on. Not that big a deal for me, but we're going to click on Bevel and Emboss, and immediately what it does is the last settings you had in here are applied. So if you think of Bevel and Emboss as trying to create lettering, text, or a symbol or some kind of object, trying to create it as a either raised up off the surface to look like something like this, or chiseled into the surface. And to do that, there are two main sections over here. One of them is called the structure, one of them is called the shading. We're going to talk about the structure all by itself before we get into the shading. And let me just say that this is kind of like blending modes. You know, there's a definition to explain how everything works, but ideally, you don't really need to know. All you need to know is basically what it does. So, I mean, for example, outer bevel looks kind of like this, and it tries to chisel on the outside of the lettering. I hope you can see my cursor here. I made it extra big for you. You have inner bevel, emboss, pillow emboss, and then stroke emboss. And outer bevel, like I said, looks to chisel something on the outside of the lettering. The inner bevel does just the opposite. It tries to go inside. You can see it looks like it's kind of rounded on those edges because it's chiseling inside rather than on the outside. The emboss comes in and tries to push in on the outside here to make it look like that it is pushed up off the surface. And then pillow emboss does just the opposite. It pushes out from the inside. So again, you don't really need to know those. You just kind of need to know how each one of them works. Stroke emboss doesn't do anything unless there's a stroke. And I don't mean us having a stroke, of course, but a stroke around the lettering. So just for grins, we'll create a stroke here. And let's kind of push it up to like 5, so it's got a nice little stroke. And if you click here and go to stroke emboss, then all the things that you change will have an effect based on the stroke. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off right quick, and we're going to forget about the stroke emboss for now. So each one of these has its own way of handling the emblem or letters or whatever it is you're trying to apply it to. And then below you have the technique on how it tries to do that. So smooth is basically what it says. It does it in a very small, smooth way. Chisel hard, excuse me, cuts into it much deeper. And then chisel soft does the same thing, except a little bit lighter. So again, it's one of those things where, like, do you apply multiply or do you apply darken or do you apply linear dodge? I don't know. Whichever one looks right to you, basically. It's the same kind of thing as it is whenever you're applying blending modes. You just come in here and you kind of have an idea of what they do. Like I like to use emboss for raising letters up off of the surface. If you think about embossing, I think about albums where you have embossing on the front of the album to put somebody's name on there. And basically embossing pushes the letters off the surface. And that's kind of the way I think about this. The only thing is, and I'm going to jump down here, is that it's not the same kind of in Photoshop, because in Photoshop you can make it go up or you can make it go down. If you make it go down, it's supposed to be pushing into the surface. If you have it go up, it's supposed to be pushing out of the surface. So even though emboss, typically you think of it as pushing out of the surface or being raised on the surface, you can make it go down by clicking on this down button here. So these have up and down, implications on how it's supposed to look. So let's just use emboss as an example. And if we're going to we'll use chisel hard and or soft, it doesn't really matter. I'm just using that as an example. The depth here is how much you want to apply that. How deep do you want that to cut, or how much do you want it to be raised off the surface? So you push that and it becomes more and more. As you can see, it's becoming more off the page here as I push it. At a certain point, it has no effect. And it's that way. See, I push it all the way up and it hasn't changed anything. So at a certain point, there is no effect. So on each one of these styles and each one of these chisels, at a certain point, there's no more depth. Now the size is basically the size of that chisel. So you can say how deep up here, but this one is how big is it? So if you push it out here, see, I just pushed it a little bit. Look at what it did. It's really, really trying to push that off the page. So 40 pixels is way too much for something like this. So you just have to kind of play around with the size on how far you want to push it up. And then soften basically softens that edge. I don't know if you can see that. Sometimes it doesn't have a whole lot of effect, but you can definitely see it there. When I push it all the way up, you push it down, it just softens that effect. So now we have this that's really pushed off the page. So if we try it again, and we're going to do an outer bevel this time. So now we have an outer bevel, and let's just try doing smooth. You can see that outer bevel smooth is just a little bit pushed up off of the surface. Then you come in here again with depth, and you push that up to give it a little bit more depth. And right there, see, it begins to have no effect. You bring it down to 84%, and then push it up a little bit, and right in here, it begins to have no effect. And again, you can go up or down. In this case, I want to chisel in, so I'm going to go down. And what I'm trying to do here is push it into the surface, because I did the down button. And if you push size, it's one of those things where how far do you want to go here? And that's kind of ridiculous right there. So you want to just kind of play a little bit with it to get the look that you want for size, and then soften again. Softens it up. So you can see this is supposed to look like it's pushed down into the surface. To me, it still looks like it's pushed out. So I mean, it's kind of, there's a lot of science here on what this stuff is, and I don't think it's worth me sitting here trying to explain to you what that science is. Whoops. I think what's important is for me to just kind of show you the different ways that you can look at this. So inner bevel, we'll play with that for a second, and look what happens now. The inner bevel is pushing in from the outside, and we'll change it to chisel hard, and then the the size as we go up. Now it gives it a really sharp ridge if we take it up too far. And this is an inner bevel, meaning that it's pushing in, and this is supposed to be pushed into the surface because we have the down button turned on. To me, again, it still looks like it's pushing up, but it's, you know, it's a perception, and it's a perspective that you look at it to decide exactly, does it do what you want it to do? And all I'm trying to do is show you what these sliders do. Now, if that's too much, we can bring it down to give it a little bit less depth. And then the size, we can bring it down so that it's a little more rounded there, and it becomes a little bit more of something that you might want to use. And then we can play with the soften. The soften sometimes does quite a bit, like right there. It really rounds out that edge rather than having it really sharp. If I bring it down, it becomes pretty sharp again. So with each one of these, it's just a little bit different, and you just have to kind of play with how deep you want it to go with this, how big you want that ridge to be, and then if you want to soften it. And sometimes they don't really do what you think they're going to do, but like this, you would think that that means it's going to be deeper into the surface here. Now, if you look at it, it's kind of like looking at one of those illusions, you know, optical illusions. Is this circle bigger than this circle type thing? And it's kind of the same here. Is it really pushing in or is it pushing out? I think it just depends on how you're looking at it. So let's look at pillow emboss. Let's look at emboss, and then we'll show you the difference between that and pillow emboss. And emboss pushes in on both sides, and then pillow emboss pushes out on both sides. So it does just the opposite. Chisel hard, we can say chisel soft. There's not really much difference there. In pillow emboss, we go to smooth, and you begin to see a little bit of something that's really kind of cool. So this looks to me like a piece of plastic that's put on top of this surface. We can change it to up if we want to, and it doesn't look to me like it made a whole lot of difference. That's supposed to be raised, and this is supposed to be into the surface, but it looks to me like it's still coming out on top of the surface. So stroke emboss, again, has to do with the stroke. It just looks at the stroke, and if there's no stroke on it, then it doesn't do anything. So if we take this stroke, we're going to go ahead and use that. And just to show you, we're going to do a 10 stroke there. And we're using stroke emboss, and we're going to push this down. And you can see that it looks like it's got a little bit of plastic, or a little bit of highlights right here. So it begins to look a little plastic like that. You can take the size, and you can make the size, make it a little bit bigger if you wanted to, or make it a little smaller. Depends on what you're going for. And then soften. Really doesn't have a big effect on this. Sometimes soften has a big effect, sometimes it's practically none. So in this case, it's practically none. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes and show you the difference here between these. And let's go back and let's just start with the outer bevel again and adjust it. And let's go down. And now, is there any questions about this? I know I went over there fairly fast, but it really is just kind of like blend mode. You just have to kind of get a feel for what's there and play with it a little bit to see if it gives you the effect you're wanting. And we're going to look at some things here in just a few minutes that will show you pretty much what I'm talking about. I mean, this right here is just one, and again, it says down, but to me it looks like it's raised up. Is there any questions?
Is there any way to do it with transparent letters where it looks like the underlying picture is what's being?
Sure. Yeah, if you wanted to put a picture, I'm just going to say okay on this. If you wanted to put a picture and clip it to that, you could certainly do that. Let me just grab something here. Let's get a texture, and we'll put another texture on that and bring it in here. And all you got to do is clip it to here, and now you got that texture on there. right? And then you could sit here and move it around to get the look that you really want back there. Is that what you were asking? Phil? Did I lose you? Anybody?
Phil, you're muted.
Yeah, what if you put the same background texture inside the letters as the overall background?
Sure.
Would it look like the it was actually embossed on the back?
Sure, you can do that. Just bring this up here and do the same thing. Turn that off, then you have that. Right?
Yeah, that's the effect that I was looking.
Yeah, basically it just, we've gone over clipping mask before, and basically you just clip that over that. Now these two are in the same place, so it looks like that it is actually seeing through that exact same image. But you have to be kind of careful. If I'm on this right here and I start moving it around, it's going to move around. See it moving around inside there? And if I move it to try to get something cool, then it may not look like it's actually bleeding through. So you would want to make sure that both of these are in the same position, both of these. Now there's probably an easier way to do this, but I mean, that was a quick way that I could think of to make it happen. Okay,
Yeah,
makes sense? Excuse me? Okay, yes, we're good. So I'm going to take those, throw them away, and we're back to where we were. So again, I can't say it enough, is you just have to kind of play with it. Take that stroke off there. We're going to go back to outer bevel here. So let's talk about the bottom part, because they have to kind of play in concert. And this is shading. The whole bottom part has to do with the shading around here, the highlights and the shadows. And what you have here is you have angle and altitude. And you have your degree angle and your degree altitude. Your angle here is what angle the light's coming from. And if you look over here to the right, there's a preview, and you can see that in this case, the light is coming from the right and the bottom. And if you look over here, you can see that the light is coming from the right and the bottom. If I want it to come from the other side, I can just switch this around. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but in this circle, there is another circle in here and a little dot in the middle. That little circle right there is the altitude. If I take that and push it out, the altitude changes. And what the altitude is supposed to do, it's supposed to be the vertical position of the light. The angle is what angle that light is coming from. What I typically will do is look over here or look at this and see how the light is falling. If it's not the way I want it, then I just grab this and kind of pull it around where I want it so that the light is falling where I want it. And if I look over here, I can see that the light is here and the light is here. And so it should be over here coming from the upper left, which is what it shows me. Okay? So I don't worry too much about these values. What I worry about is where the light is. And I just kind of grab that little circle and move it around this circle. And that's going to determine what the light looks like. Okay? So, I mean, I could go through the discussion of what each one of these is, but I think it's the thing that makes the most sense is just grab this little circle right here. Now, hopefully you can see that, and just kind of move it around, and you can see it moving, changing this value right here, and changing the light over here, and changing this light. Now, as you move this in and out, the altitude changes. So if I push it in, your altitude changes to 26, and this value becomes a little sharper. So you just play around with that till you get what you want. And that looks pretty good to me right there. may want that light to be a little sharper, so I'm just going to push it in, try to keep it on about 50, and now that light's a little sharper. So that's about all I'm going to say on that. And, you know, just look at this or look at how the light's falling over here. And in this case, with this background, it really doesn't matter how you have the light coming. If you had elements in here where the light is actually hitting them in a certain direction, you definitely want the light to hit this in the same direction, because it's not going to make sense if it doesn't. Now, gloss contour. This is basically a curves graph. So if I click on this, you'll see that this is just a curves thing. The higher it is on the curve, the more intense. The lower it is, the less intense. So what this is saying is that there is a linear drop-off or a linear gain of shadow to light to highlight. So the shadows are basically transparent, because the bottom here is 0 opacity. The top up here is 100% opacity. So it's saying that the black, or the shadows to highlights, is a linear, it goes from shadows to highlights in a linear fashion, and it's more intense the more you get to your highlights. So I'm not going to say much more than that, except to tell you that there are more graphs in here, and these all come seated, and basically each one of these has a different effect on how this light works. So if I click on this one, see how the light changes there. The light is still coming from the same direction, but if you look over here, it's kind of, I mean, it's kind of, it doesn't show that it doesn't look like it's coming from the same direction. So these kind of counter react against these, if you want to think of it that way. So if you still want the light to be coming from the other direction, you're going to have to play with this light again if you like this kind of intensity. For me, I come in here and I look at a couple of these and I kind of make a decision what I want. And I really usually like something close to linear, but there's no reason you can't come in here. Sometimes this is called a cone. Sometimes it works really well. Excuse me. But typically what I'd like to do is I still like to have these pretty linear. So I'll start with this, and then I may go with something here that looks fairly linear. These are just a little bit of a variation of that linear curve. So this one is kind of nice here in that it shows quite a bit of light in the way it looks. So I might go with that one. And then you have the highlight mode and the shadow mode. And right now, the highlight mode is set to a blend mode of screen and white, and it's at 61%. So you can change the opacity here to make that highlight less intense, or you can bring it way up to make it really sharp. So if you really want to play with that to get a better set of shadows in here and highlights, then you can play with these and make the shadows a lot darker and make the highlights a lot lighter and have some real good contrast in there. It looks pretty cool that way. Another thing you can do is you don't have to continue with screen and multiply in white and black. If I want the highlights to be, you know, maybe one of these colors, I could make it this color, and now I have my highlights as the color of the background. I could also come in here and say, well, let's make that linear dodge. And now look at it. It's really kind of, really, I don't know, gnarly, I guess. It's really, really brightening up. It looks a little different. So it looks kind of like it's lightening up from the background. So you could do that, and you could do the same thing with the shadows. You know, if you wanted to have the shadows to be a different color, you could come in here and click on this, maybe this right here, and then come in here and do the same kind of thing. Let's try linear burn. See what, it really doesn't affect the shadow. I mean, the shadows are just not as bright in this instance, and it won't be when you have a dark background like this. But there's nothing to say that you can't do, you know, make some changes here. And if you wanted a contrasting color to this, it's kind of, it could be kind of an off blue color. So you could come in here in blue and take a, excuse me, and you get to see it in advance. So you can come in here and kind of see that this is a little bit of a blue, and if this is where you want it to be, you know, you can move it around here and get something kind of bright like that. And so you have a contrasting color here in your highlights. And maybe I don't want linear dodge. In this case, maybe I want color dodge to kind of tone it down a little bit. So this is something pretty cool that you can play with if you want to get a different look. This blue may not really work with this, but it just gives you an example of how that works. So, and in this case, your light is still in here the way we had it, still coming in the same direction. You have this contour that gives it a kind of a sharp look, and then you have these different changes of your highlight mode and your shadow mode. Now maybe I want the highlights to be a little bit softer, just kind of a hint right there, so I can bring that down, or maybe I want it to be really bright. So again, just whatever you're looking for. And then at the bottom, you know, if you really messed it up and you really don't know where to go and you want to start over, you can just change it and restore to the default. If you want this, and this is one of your best ones you've ever done, and you want to keep it as a default, then you can make it your default. So that's what these two buttons are. So that's a pretty quick rundown of what shading does. Do we have any questions about that? Like I said, this is kind of like blend modes. You just have to kind of come in and play with it a little bit to get an idea of how to move around and how to try things. So basically, that's all I do is I just come in when I'm creating a banner or something, when I want to have something real cool for the name or the school name or whatever across it. Then first thing I look for is what font do I want, and then after I have my font, then I come in and start deciding how do I want to do this. Do I want it to be an inner bevel, an outer bevel, emboss? And I usually try all three and say, this one I think looks better, and then I just go in and start playing with the depth and everything. And I already have an idea down here. This down here is pretty much a done deal for me, how I want to do it. And usually I have it coming with the light coming from left, but it depends on what kind of image I have in the background. And usually I have one of these kind of, fairly linear contours that I'm using. I usually have anti-alias turned on. I'm not sure why that's not on. And then the highlight mode, I typically leave these to black and white, but there's always a chance that I'll change, especially the highlight mode. And color dodge and linear dodge are really, really interesting blend modes that can really make things pop. So if there are no questions about that, we'll come over here and look at contour. Contour is basically the same thing that you have right here. And I got to tell you, I never use this, but it doesn't mean that it's not useful, because I use it over here. And then if I come over here, this is supposed to be for the gloss contour. So it's supposed to be for the, if you had a metal look on there, that this contour would really make the metal pop with the highlight and shadow contrast. This contour is supposed to be used more for the entire image. So again, you have the same kind of thing. If you click on something like this, or something like this. But I tend to leave it pretty much, like I said, fairly linear. Then you have a range that you can make it apply. See how that's different, how that changes. So that is applied, I said over the entire thing. I meant over the bevel, or the, whatever your bevel or emboss that you're using. It's actually applied all over that. So I typically don't do anything there. Texture is kind of interesting too, and you can use this texture, and this texture is just for your bevel or emboss that you have. You can see that around here that's all that's being applied to, and you have these kinds of textures in here, and you can add more textures just by clicking on this and then coming down here and import more patterns or add your you know, wherever, if you have some out there that you want to add, or if you have some that you've gotten from somebody, you know, you can import them in here too. I don't use patterns or textures from here very much. I have my own textures over here that I use all the time. But, you know, you have the ability to add these kind of textures in here just for the embossed part or the beveled part. And, you know, sometimes they're kind of cool. But I usually don't do much with them. There you go. You can scale them up so they're really big, or make them down here where they're fairly small like this. You can barely see them. So that's what the scale does, is how big do you want it. The depth is how far into the bevel do you want to take it. Right here. I don't ever use this texture, like I said, but it may turn out pretty cool. Invert, if you want to invert that, whatever you've done here, you just click on the invert and it reverses it. In this case, it's just a circular or square type pattern, so inverting it doesn't do anything. And link with layer, that just means that if I come in here and I move this RTPC around, that it's going to move the pattern along with it so that it doesn't change. If this were a pattern that changed, let's see if there's one in here that I can use, like with trees maybe. I don't know. We got trees here. It doesn't look like it's doing anything. But anyway, if you had something in here that wasn't a linear or a circular pattern and it changed, if you move this around, kind of like I was talking about a while ago with the texture over here, if I move the RTPC around, if you don't have it linked with a layer, then it's going to, that pattern in there may change. So that's what linked with layer is. And that's default to be checked like that. So any questions on anything that put you to sleep? Let's go look at this. It's a Pontiac emblem. I downloaded this from the internet, so it's an illegal download that I stole from somebody, so I'm not going to use it on anything but just for showing you this. But I brought it in and then I extracted it off the background. So I just thought it would be kind of a cool thing to work with. And what we can do is come in here and do kind of the same kind of thing. Bevel and emboss. And whenever I click on this, notice it's got the exact same things that I used last time. So if I want to reset it, I reset it to default, and now we're back to the default that we started with when we started today. So if I do an outer bevel and I do it down, and we're going to do a chisel hard, and we're going to take this up a little bit. It's beginning to get a little bit of a bevel there. Then I push this up a little bit. Whoops, too much. And you get that, and then we can soften it some. So it looks kind of like it's coming off the page. Now what I want to do is take it and have the light. Looks like the light is really coming almost from straight left. So I have the light coming from the straight left. Now, I didn't talk about global light a minute ago, and I guess I just went right through it. Global light, basically, if this is checked, that means that any other of these that have light direction in them will maintain this exact same values. So, for example, drop shadow. If I click on drop shadow, it has 179, which is the same thing as what I have over here, 179. So whatever I turn this to, they will maintain the same, exact same light, okay? So the outer bevel, chiseled hard, and I brought it way up here, and I'm gonna go up just a little bit more. So I want to get just a little bit more of a bevel there. And then we'll come in here, and just for grins, I'll go with this. And we'll come in here, and since this is pretty bright, I'm going to try to do a different kind of a highlight here, just a different color so that we can see what's going on. I'm just going to pick, I don't know, kind of an off red maybe. It's kind of a purple. Kind of a pink, I guess. And I don't know if we'll be able to see that because that's pretty bright too. If I bring that up, now you can kind of see that. And that's probably the wrong color, but I just wanted you to see it. Maybe if I do kind of a yellow. Let's do a yellow. There. That yellow looks pretty cool. And it's 91%. So now you see that I have my highlights that are shaded in yellow, and I have it on screen. Now, again, let's take that to linear dodge, and it really pumps it up. So I may want to bring it down a little bit so that it's not so bright. Ooh, there you go. I have to bring it way down so it's not so bright. But you can see what it's doing. And then multiply. We're going to try to keep that as black. We're going to just pump that up so it becomes a lot more contrast. So you can see how we've changed that. And excuse me. If we take this and make it go up instead, everything jumps to the other side. So that's something to think about too. Your light is now coming from the left, which is really what I wanted anyway, because it looks to me like that this texture in the background, the light is kind of coming from this direction, maybe a little bit even up like this, but particularly in this direction. So I want the highlights to be on the left side. So by doing that change, I have the highlights on the left side. So you have those kind of pumped up there now. And if I really want that to be even more pronounced, I just keep going with this. And now it looks like it's really pushed out from the background. Any questions on that? I'm going real quick on this, so we'll be able to do drop shadow and stroke probably along with this. I said we were doing inner glow or inner shadow, but I'm not ready for that. So this is kind of the way I get my look that I want. Is I come in and I start looking at it and I go, well, I like that, but I don't like that. Or I'm thinking maybe I want it to look like this. And so I play until I get there. So let's close that and let's look at something else. Now this is something that's not in your files that I downloaded, because this is just something we're going to kind of build as we go. I thought maybe we could try to do a Christmas card, because a lot of the, using text that you may want to do would be doing something like creating different kinds of cards, or a flyer of some kind. Because you can use Bevel and Emboss on different elements, but you really can't use it on like a landscape. So, I mean, there's really nothing, there's no edges there that it's going to see, because it's just a big square in the eyes of Bevel and Emboss. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at some Christmas art. And this is some stuff that I have that I've gotten from different vendors over the years. From when I bought certain things, I get these kind of things along with it. So, excuse me. So you have something like this, which is just it's just like clip art. You can kind of push it over here, and I'm not very good at just kind of creating things on the fly, so we'll see how this goes. So we have Merry Christmas here. Now, do we want it to be in black? Probably not. Let's make it in red. So I'm going to do a solid color adjustment layer, and I'm going to make it red. Something like right in there. It's probably a little bit bright. So a little darker here, and then I'm going to clip that to Merry Christmas. So now we have red Merry Christmas. Now what we can do with that is double click over here or click down here and go to Bevel and Emboss and begin to try to make this pop out a little bit. So I'm going to go to Emboss and chisel hard. Got it up like this. It's really not doing a whole lot. Let's try. Oh, you know what? I'm up here on the solid color adjustment. I was wondering why nothing would work. So you got to click down here. And one more time, bevel and emboss. There we go. Now it's beginning to work. So it's a little bit strong. Maybe would like that, but I really don't like the size. So let's bring the size down. There we go. So that looks a little bit better. Now we've got a really ugly yellow as the shadow, the highlights. So we probably want to change that. We'll go back to white and go back to screen. And now we have a nice little white highlight there. And you can see that it looks like it's raised up off the page. Now, we'll see in a minute, but you can also put like a drop shadow on it and do some other things. You can go in and do an inner shadow or inner glow, which would give it an even nicer look. But right now we're just looking at the bevel and emboss. So this looks kind of cool to me. Now, where's the light coming from? Wherever the light's coming from on here, we want the same light direction for everything else. So you just have to keep that in mind. So here we have 90 degrees and 30. So we're just going to leave it at that. We're going to leave the gloss contour. We're not going to touch anything else. So I'm going to say, okay. And now what I'm going to do is bring over something else maybe. Which I don't really have anything else good in here. But another place that I had some nice artwork for Christmas was in shapes and also in brushes. So I'm going to go to shapes, and we haven't gone over this before, so basically you would go in here and go down here to custom shape tool right here. And it's part of shapes, which I've said, hide this, but custom shape tool is right here. And then you come over here to your shapes, and you've got all these shapes. Leaf, trees, wild animals, boats, and flowers all come seated with Photoshop. If you want to add some wild animals in here, you could come in here and add a giraffe or a camel or something like that. But we're going to do Christmas shapes. So we're going to come down here, and I'm going to grab this right here. I'm going to click on it, and then I'm just going to come down here and draw it. And then I just hit enter. And you can't see it because of the color that it is. Oops. Let me put it up here. And we're going to change the color. Again, solid color adjustment. We're going to make it gold. And I'm going to put that on there. And so why can I not see it? Oh, it's all clipped. That's the problem. Okay, unclip it there, but clip it here. I don't actually need this anymore. So there we go. Sorry about that. When I brought it in, it attached itself to this, which is clipped down here, so it became clipped to that too. So you have to be careful for those kind of things. But here we have this right here. So let's just try to do some bevel and emboss on it as well. So let's double click here and go over here to bevel and emboss. And it gives me the same settings that I had for this over here. So if I'm happy with that, I don't have to do anything. But if I really want it to look a little different than this, then I can play around with those again. But in this case, it looks real similar, so I'm not going to do anything to it. So I'm just going to click OK. And now we have this. Now it's got these little blue edges on it here because of the way that I colored it. But I'm just going to leave it alone for now. And I'm going to move it up here. Here we go. So now I'm going to go and I'm going to grab another one. I'm going to have to come back over here again. There we go. And grab a different one. Let's do a Christmas tree. Do this Christmas tree. So I'm going to do a Christmas tree like this. These are just shapes that you can get. You can probably go on the internet and you can say free shapes or free Christmas shapes for Photoshop. And I'm sure there's some out there that you can download for free. And you just bring them in and then you can get to them like this. And again, Bevel and Emboss, same thing. I'll leave it like it is. The other thing you can do is go to brushes, which I have some brushes too that are also Christmas brushes. And here they are right here. So you can do the same kind of thing with these. I have a Santa Claus, and I have some gifts and candy canes and all kinds of stuff here. So you could come in here, let's just do this, and come in here on a separate layer. And the brush is extremely large, so I have to bring it down. So give me a second here, there we go. It always opens up at the largest size. Whoops. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to turn the brush over. That's actually not what I wanted. There we go. That's what I wanted. So I can grab this and turn it over like this. Yeah, so my brush is more like this, and I could put it under Christmas here. And it's going to be whatever color my foreground brush is. So if I don't like it being gold, I can change that and make it maybe red to go along with this red. Maybe I can make it the same color. And then come in here and click. And it gives me the brush, or the wreath, or the, sorry, the berry right there. So what I can do now, something I want to be sure and mention, if you look how much bigger my brush is than what it actually painted. I just found this out today for any of you that Mac users that are out there, and there may not be any of you, but I increased the size of my brush so that I could see it, because I was having trouble locating my brush, showing you guys how to do certain things. And then today I wanted to make sure that my brush was big enough so you could see it on the screen. But I was wondering why, when I click in here like this, it gives me a much smaller brush. And the reason is because whenever you increase the size of your brush on the Mac, it keeps the size of the brush that is defined in Photoshop. So even though my cursor is bigger, the brush is smaller. So it really messes me up. So just so you know, if I want to make this a lot bigger, I'm going to have to go something like this and come in here and click. And that's in the wrong place. So something like that. So anyway, that was just some food for thought there. And whenever I am done with this, I'm going to go back and resize my cursor back to normal so that whenever I click, it's actually the size that I see on the screen. Excuse me. So anyway, I take that now and I can double click over here. And again, we can go to Bevel and Emboss. And maybe that's a little too much. So I may want to, for this particular one, I may want to bring it down a little bit. And that would probably be in a size. I bring that down to like 4, maybe it is in the depth. Bring it down, there we go. So it's not so harsh. It's still raised above it, but it's not so harsh. And you have your highlights in here. Again, the light is coming from straight above on all of these. So you can tell because you have your highlights on the top and your shadows are down on the bottom, just like they are up here. Highlights on the top of all these letters and down on the bottom. So if you wanted to, then the next thing you could do is, let me just move this up here a little bit. Then I could come in here and do a text layer. Now this is not some of my better work, so I realize that. So I'm going to come in here and we're going to use this text. And I'm going to say something like this at probably down here around 20, maybe 14. Okay, and then we're going to come over here and I'm going to push this up like this. Okay, so now I would say something like best the holidays, something like that. So I have this. Let's move it up. Whoops, wrong layer. Take that, move it up a little bit. And now we're going to take that, and it might be a little small for this, but pretend like it's okay. And now we'll do a bevel emboss for that. And if you come in here, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see that it's pretty, whoops, it's pretty strong. So you probably would want to bring this down some, and maybe even want to do something different. Maybe an emboss, and then bring the size up some, something like in there, or I'm sorry, the depth, and then the size up a little bit. Something, it's kind of hard to move this mouse and just get what you want. So there we go, and it's softened pretty good, and the light, we're going to leave the light the way it is. So you get something like that. It probably would look better if it were a little bigger. So we'll take it and make it just a little bit bigger. But you get the idea that you could make this look like it's coming off the page as well. And then you could come in here and add another text. I'll change this to Arial and make it about 8 points and just say, which is something like that. And you have that. Grab the right layer here. Move that up here and then maybe double click on it and bevel and emboss. And that's a little bit much there too. So we zoom in here so we can see it. And I think we need to bring multiply down a little bit, would help. And then make this like 3. Bring this up a little bit. So smooth. You get the idea. You just kind of play around in here with what you want. Questions? I just said to delete that. So the point is a couple things. You really can't do this with like a landscape, which I know that's what most of us do, or portraits. This is really for all of these blending modes as far as that goes. All of these blending modes in here, with the exception of blending options, all of these in here are really for objects that you're putting into an image. So they're for like creating Christmas cards, or they're like creating banners or pamphlets or something like that, where you really want some lettering. I guess you could put this, you know, create your own Christmas card with your landscape on it and put Merry Christmas on top of it and give that Merry Christmas a bevel and emboss or something like that. But the point is that you don't take a picture or an image out of your camera and bring it up in Photoshop and start applying bevel and emboss, because it doesn't do anything. It's looking for edges, and the only edge on the landscape is just these 4 edges around here. So in these, you have edges, you know, that go around and in the middle and all through here, because there's transparency in the middle here. Same with the lettering and right here. So that's one point. The other point is that it's just going to take a little bit of work and a little bit of time, because it's a lot like blending modes. I mean, like I said, I could sit here and explain to you the science behind it, but first of all, I probably wouldn't do a very good job. And second of all, it's boring and you really don't care. What you care about is looking at what each one of them does and then making a decision on those as to what you want to do. So that is about it for blending. I mean, for Bevel and Emboss. Do I have any more questions? Is everybody asleep? Bored you to tears, huh?
No,
Oh,
still awake.
we're awake. Just have to figure out how to unmute.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, this is not something that you use every day. This is something that if you're building something, creating something that is, you know, it's not like working on a photo. Of course, you can have a photo in here, but the photo is not going to be affected by the bevel and emboss. It's going to be these kind of elements that you bring in here, typically text. And then if you have any shapes or brushes or anything like that, then it can affect that.
I do a Christmas card each year. I might try some of this coming season.
Yeah, and you know, if you do anything like that, you know, it's always something to think about. And there's more to it than this because, I mean, there are some other things that we'll talk about, you know, like inner shadow and inner glow. Those will have an effect on what it can look like on the inside. There's gradient overlay. If I click on gradient overlay, there's some really cool stuff you can do there. For example, right there. Now that's on the wood fence, so you can't really see it. But if I did it on one of these, let's do it on this one. So if I did a gradient overlay, it's black and white right there. But if I did like, you can see that it changes colors there because it's a gradient. And if I do black and white, then it's actually silver. So I mean, you can do some really cool stuff when we'll get to gradient maps. We've talked about those before, but we haven't really used them in this sense. And I use these all the time whenever I'm doing text on a banner, because you can do something like this that says reflected, and it becomes reflected. So the middle part of it is one color and the top and bottom are the same color. So like their top and bottom's dark and the middle is red. So you can do that, and you can reverse it so that it's the other way around. So there's lots of stuff in here, and I'm not going to spoil that for later, but and outer glow, and then of course a drop shadow. You can always put a drop shadow on one of these, and we'll talk about that as well here pretty soon. So, excuse me. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, or actually last time was tip of the iceberg. This is getting a little deeper into the water with it, and realizing that it goes forever. So we're probably going to end early tonight. I expected this to take like an hour and a half, and it only took like an hour. So what I want to talk about now, if there are no more questions, is let's talk about we'll talk about the stroke as well as drop shadow. Those are two fairly simple ones to work with. And next time we will talk about probably inner shadow and inner glow and maybe satin. Just kind of go down the list here. And incidentally, I want to make sure, excuse me, that I don't forget to tell you that the next one will be in 3 weeks and not 2 weeks. I have a conflict in 2 weeks. So I'll put a notice out, but that's just so you know. So if we go back over here, and we kind of did a stroke already, but let's just talk about the stroke. And by the way, these pluses, that means that there are multiple strokes in here, because if I do it and then I create a different stroke with a different color or something, it creates another entry in here. And in order to get rid of those, you have to come down here and tell it to reset the default list or delete hidden effects. So it will delete those and go back to your default. Right now, I'm not going to do that, but that's why there's a plus in here. So, because you can add another, another definition of what another stroke would be. So you could actually put two strokes on the same image. In this case, we're not going to do that, but so if you click and check and then click on there, and this is one of the things that I had trouble remembering. It's just because I click on there, it's going to add the definition, but I have to actually click there in order for it to open up the layer style information. Excuse me. So for a stroke, excuse me, your stroke, whenever you define it here, you're telling it how big of that stroke is in the number of pixels. So that's pretty simple to understand. Then do you want it on the inside, outside, or center? Center meaning it's right on the edge, of course, where outside means it's actually outside of the lettering or the object, and inside on the inside. Typically, you think of a stroke as being on the outside, but sometimes, many times, I find myself putting it on the inside. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water here. Okay, so if we have a stroke on the inside at 10 pixels, then we can apply a blend mode to it. Excuse me. And tell it what opacity that we want it to be applied to it. Now, I have to tell you, I don't know what overprint means. I'm going to have to come back to you with that one. I wasn't planning on necessarily doing this tonight, but I'll have to check that out. I'm not sure what overprint means. I'm sure it means like overprint something else, print on top of something else, but I'm not sure what else it means. Then you have the fill type. Do you want it to be a gradient, a pattern, or a color? In this instance, we're using a color, and this is the color. So what we're going to do is change it from black to white, and you can see what happens here when we change it from black to white. And then I can change this and go to multiply, and it kind of basically makes it invisible. Linear burn doesn't do anything, so any of these darken modes just makes it invisible. Then I can come down here to screen. They kind of make it invisible too. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. It added it. Lighter color. Screen. I just went too fast. Color dodge, but they all make it white, pure white, so they really don't have an effect. And if you come down here to one of your contrast modes, it's actually contrasting it with the background, which is kind of interesting. I typically just use the standard normal on these when I'm putting a stroke on something like this. But you can, and this is on the inside, by the way, so if we want it on the outside, it's going to look like that. And so you can see how it affects it that way. So it's a big difference, a huge difference. Center just kind of puts it right on top, and you can see that it actually is on top because you can see part of the edge along here, especially in here. So interesting. I typically, like I said, put on the outside. And then I rarely make one this big, so it's going to probably be around 5 in this instance. And you can see the effect it has over here. And that's because of the way the light is shining. Remember from your Bevel and Emboss that you have on top of it. So then you have your opacity if you want to make it a little bit less pronounced, just like anything else. And instead of the color white, I could put a gradient in there. And it could be one of these gradients that I have here. Then you have to define what your gradient's going to be. And I'm going to save that till later because it's the exact same thing. One thing's the exact same thing we've been over before with gradients, but it also is the exact same thing you do down here in the gradient overlay. So, but it's in this case, it's only affected on the stroke. So if I had the stroke to be, be bigger, I said I was going to save it, but I'm showing you anyway. And I change this to this or this. It changes. See how it affects it all the way across like that. It's dark at the bottom, but it's white at the top. And that's because it's a gradient overlay, and it is at this direction. So it's linear. So if I tell it to not be linear, I could tell it to be radial, and it would give you a different look, or angled, or redirected, or reflected, I mean, or any of these others, it would give you a different look. So anyway, we're not going to use gradient. We're going to use, or you could use a pattern, again, like before. So on the stroke, you have this pattern. If I wanted it to be trees, they're blue trees, but they're trees, or maybe grass, and it does something like that. And this all has to do with the colors that we're using over here in our Bevel and Emboss. So that's why they're kind of funky colors. And the light, the way the light is on Bevel and Emboss, that's why this is a bluish and this is kind of a green yellow. So they're different colors because of that. But anyway, you could do that, and then you could take the angle of it and turn it a different way. You could scale it to make it bigger, more pronounced, like that. Or you could bring it down, if I can grab it here, and make it real finite like that. So I never use this, but it's available there, and it might be something that's really kind of cool for whatever it is that you're creating. So there's more to the stroke than just adding a line around it. But most of the time, that's the way I do it. So I come in, and I typically have a trouble with the slider here with my mouse, so I'll just type it in and maybe put a 2 on there and just have a very light stroke around it to give it that kind of a look. And with the bevel and everything lighted the way it is, you can see that it's just kind of reflecting insert on the sides of it like that. So I think that looks pretty cool. I think I'd get rid, if I were trying to do this for good, I would try to get rid of this blue cast on it that's on the Bevel and Emboss here, and come back and make this probably white like that. And then probably go back to screen and have something like this. But, you know, it depends on what you're wanting to do. So again, the stroke, pretty simple. We go to center, gives you a little different look. We go to inside, a little different look, and it's just this little fine line right there. It's not this out here, which is what you may be thinking. It's this little fine line that's inside here. And it's only 2 pixels. And again, I could make it 4 pixels, and you can see it a little bit better right there. Any questions on stroke? That one is pretty simple. All right. We can just stay on this one, I guess, if we want to, and just put in a drop shadow. And drop shadow, again, is another one that I use quite often, especially when I'm doing banners and stuff, because you really, it kind of makes it look like it belongs there, and it's not just painted on. It actually looks like something that has been pasted on there or something, rather than just, you know, painted on. So in order to put my drop shadow in, again, you have a blend mode, and you can use whatever you want to. Typically, I'll use black with multiply. It's my default, and I think it's the default from Photoshop. Excuse me. But you could have a different color in there. Like if I wanted to go with the silver or something, I could do that, or gray. And then, excuse me, if you look over here again, this is where your shadow is. And if I bring the distance up, now actually, yeah, let's see. That's spread size. It's, there we go. I'm just too impatient. Let's come back here. Let me, oh, I need to bring my opacity up. That's why I can't see it. So distance is how far, of course, how far away from the edge do you want it? Let's just make it black so we can see it. Like we had it. How far away from the edge do we want it? And actually the shadow is on the opposite side. And if I spread, it's going to push it away. So see that? See the difference? Let me turn this around so you can see it. Now the shadow's on this side. So if the distance is how far away from the letters you want it, see, I just really have it kind of way out there so you can see it. And the spread is how big it is. So it grows here as you make it bigger. And then the size will actually kind of feather it. If I bring the size way down here, it becomes very hard like that. So if I bring the size up, it becomes a little bit more feathered to look something like that. So that's kind of how you play with these things. The distance is how far away it is. The size is how big it is. And then the spread is how big it is. And then the size just kind of feathers that. So you can look at it. Now, the other thing you can do with these is you can just grab it here and you can, well, I say you can, you used to could, and move it around. Okay, make a liar out of me. I know you can do that because I've done it. I must be doing something wrong up here. But you can actually grab it and move it around to where you want it. And I did that earlier today too, so I'm not sure. Maybe it's low on memory or something here. But anyway, and then you have the contour again that you can do, same kind of thing with your shadow. And it's going to have a different appearance. Now, see, you do this, and you have basically just a outline of a shadow. If I use this one, because it's basically saying that the shadows are the well, it's saying the midpoints in your graph. I double click on this. This is where your most intensity is all your values that fall on your midpoints. You're going to have transparency in your highlights and transparencies in your shadows and it's going to become more less transparent as you come along here, and they become fully transparent. And then as it goes down, it's going to become less opacity. If that makes sense. I didn't say that quite right. But down here at the bottom, if it's at the bottom, that means it's clear. It's invisible. If it's up here at the top, that means it's 100% opacity. So as it travels along the line here, this black to white, so shadows to highlights, it becomes more and more, opacity becomes higher and higher and higher till it gets to 100%, and then it becomes lower and lower and lower till it gets to 0%. So that's the way this thing works. So again, who cares how they work? Just kind of click in here and see something that you kind of like. And for me, again, it's these linear ones, fairly linear, that I really kind of like. So I would probably just pick one of these, like that one. And then you can add noise to your drop shadow if you want to. So you just kind of push this up here and look at, you can make noise out of it. So if you have something, you know, special effect or something that you want to do that to, you probably don't want to go that far, but you could make it noisy, and you could even make it a different color and make it noisy in there on top of it. So layer knocks out drop shadow. Basically, that's, you remember last time when I talked about blend modes, if you have that checked over here, go back to blending options, you have this knockout. Where does it knock out? Shallow and deep. It's the same thing over here where you say drop shadow. If you have that clicked, that means that if your blend mode knocks it out to the layer below, it also knocks out the shadow. Okay. And I know that's clear as mud because I don't really pay attention to that. I just leave it checked. And what that does is it makes it act the same way all the time. So that is pretty much the drop shadow. Now it irritates me that I can't, oh, there we go. Now see, I can move it around now. So if I wanted to make it, you know, farther out in the distance, I can move it away. So this helps with the distance if you want to play around with it this way. Now, I typically don't do that. I just do it up here, but you could do that if you wanted to. So I feel better now because I knew that would work. So that is the drop shadow, and I do use drop shadows a lot, especially a lot of times if I come out here, you know, let's go ahead and do this. Let's look at the Pontiac emblem again, and maybe you want to put a drop shadow on Pontiac. Well, you can't really do it on just Pontiac because I don't have it separate, but you can come in here and do drop shadow on both of them, and push the distance out a little bit. Spread. So, and you may want to not use global light for this one and just kind of take it and pull it so that it comes in this direction or in this direction at like 45. And now you have the drop shadow, and the drop shadow, you might want to make it a little bit more. It's a 35, so let's be able to see it. So there we go. And I think I had it right to begin with. Right in there, there you go. So now you have the shadow down like light is coming from the upper left. And maybe bring this down so that it's a little sharper. Okay. Maybe spread just a little bit. So now you've got a little bit of a drop shadow here, and it actually looks a little bit more reasonable that it should belong here. It looks more like there's a bevel and emboss around it because you have this drop shadow that really makes it stand out. And then of course on your Christmas card, you could do the same thing here on this Merry Christmas. You could do a drop shadow on that and turn it up a little bit. Am I on Merry Christmas? I am. There we go. Make it a little bit, spread out a little bit more. So now I've got a really nice drop shadow there that you can turn on and off. You can turn it off over here and see before and the after. So now it's got a nice drop shadow that makes it look a little bit more like it belongs. So the things in here working together makes a big difference. So just doing the bevel and emboss gets you a lot, but like, you know, for this one again, add the drop shadow on it and it makes such a difference. Take this, move it up a little bit. You can see the shadow there. So now this looks more like it's part of it. It belongs. Does that make sense? So these things, like I just said, they work together a lot. So you know, working with one is you know, gets you a long way there, but understanding how they can work together is going to make a huge difference in the way that your final product looks. So that's really all I have tonight. Is there anything you would like for me to show you? I mean, we have 35 minutes here, 38 minutes here. If there's anything that you would like for me to do, show you now, or anything you would like for the next time we get together in particular, on top of the...
Hey, Bob,
Yes.
I was wondering, like, whenever you're doing composites and you're trying to add a shadow to something that, like when I replaced the background of a dog and then I wanted the shadow of the legs of the dog, would you use a drop shadow like this to make the dog an object and then do a drop shadow? Or would you actually, I just made a copy and then I made it transparent and erased everything but the shadow that I wanted.
Yeah, you can approach that a few different ways. There is a way that you can use the drop shadow, and then you have to tell the, when you use the drop shadow, you have to come in here, and I think that it's in here somewhere where you say change the layer style to a layer or something like that. Copy layer style, that's not it. But there's something in here. I haven't done it in a long time. There's some way in here where you can take that layer style and turn it into a layer itself. So you have to have it on a layer itself in order to really make it work, because all it's going to do is push black out to one side. And you're going to have to manipulate that shadow a little bit, especially if they're in a different perspective. Typically, the second way is to copy the shadow along with it, if there was a shadow, and then use that shadow in your image, because then you have the actual shadow, and that's the best way really to do it if you have that capability, or if you have that availability. If there wasn't a shadow along with it, then of course you have to create your own. And what I do is pretty much what you just said. What I do like 99% of the time is I make a copy of it, and then I turn it to black, and then I will move it wherever I need it and soften it, and then I'll gradate it so that it's darker, closer to them, and then I will apply a Gaussian blur on it to blur it a little bit, depending on how hard I want that shadow to be. So it depends, to answer your question, but 99% of the time I'm creating it from scratch. So in a case like this, for example, if I didn't have this drop shadow in here, I could take this and copy it, and then I would take this and probably throw away all the effects and take it and do this and then fill it with black, which is this. Turn off this, and then I would take it and put it below it, and then what did I do? Oh, I put it inside this group. Sorry. There we go. And then I would take that with my move tool and just kind of move it out to where I want it. It's not working real good with this particular thing, but you could have it something like that. And then I would take it and apply a Gaussian blur on it. And I would do the blur I would gradate it as well. So you bring the blur down here, something down here, what looks really good. Just kind of keep looking at it till you get it there. I would gradate that, especially if it's a person, but then I would also come in here and probably apply a mask on it and then mask it as a gradation as well. So, and then probably bring the opacity down some, depending. Does that make sense? Does that go too fast for you?
No, that's exactly what I did. So yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, the other thing that you can do with that is if it's at an angle, so if you have somebody that's turned a certain way, then you can come in here with your tool and or your free transform tool, and you can warp it so that it goes in the direction you need it to go. So if they are at a particular angle or different perspective, or you could do, you know, your perspective tool in here as well and change your perspective so that it looks the way it's supposed to look. So, I mean, I do that a lot. And if I have the light coming from behind and they're going to be in front, so in other words, let's say the light was coming from behind and this was going to be in front, I would take this free transform and flip it vertical so it's upside down. And then you have this, but then you've got all of these out of place. So I would have to play around with this to cut these or extend them so that they actually touch here, so that they're actually, you know, you take it and whoops, sorry. I still haven't gotten used to the change that they made to the free transform tool last year. So I have to do a shift and then push this down and kind of squeeze it down so that it's like this. And then I would have to cut it and paste a little bit onto the end here, and then cut it and then paste it on up here so that it actually looks like a real shadow, or have it elongated so that, you know, extend this up and then extend these up so that it looks like, depending on what perspective I have the light coming from behind. So I do that a lot too. Is that too much?
No, thank you.
So there's lots of different ways to do that. And actually I learned a lot of that from Richard, especially the part about cutting it out and pasting it so that if this doesn't touch up here like it's supposed to, then you have to kind of make it fit. So, you know, these are going to touch, they're supposed to, and in normal life, you know, a regular shadow, they would. I guess I could also do the perspective here and try to turn it up like that as well to make it look more like it's coming from behind. And then I would have to kind of push that to make these. So it's not easy sometimes. This would not be an easy one the way it's set up. Any other questions, anything at all on any topic?
Well, I do have a question. A long time ago in Photoshop, I had it so that the cursor would indicate the size of the brush. Like if I were going to do a clone, I could tell how big the brush was just by the size of the cursor. That went
Okay.
away. Do you know what I'm talking about? Same thing is true with the healing tool. Before, I was able to tell how big of an area I was going to affect, but they made a change, or I inadvertently made a change, and that went away. Do you know how to get that back?
I've been struggling with, what's that?
Mary,
Yes.
you said a long time. If you have caps lock, the size of your brush goes away. But you know, I almost
Yeah.
shot myself several times before I figured that out.
No, and I don't think
Yeah.
it has anything to do with caps lock. It has to
Then-
do,
Then
and
it's
you know, I
probably-
use the right and left bracket to make the size larger or smaller.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and right now, the very first time that I want to use that tool, I have no idea how big it's sitting right there.
Well, look up here. Can you see my cursor?
Uh-huh,
It tells you right there it's 67.
uh-huh.
No,
So
that's
if
not real helpful.
If that helps, as you move, hit the bracket keys, it changes.
Right,
So you can tell from up there, you
Yeah.
can't see it on the brush, but you can tell by looking up there how big it is. And that's why I knew a while ago that the brush was so big. It was at 2,400 pixels.
right.
So you can tell it from up here. Now, do you use a tablet as well? Wacom
No,
tablet?
I have one, but I don't use it.
Now see if you use the option control, then you can go up and down, left and right, changes the size of your brush as well. And you can see it that way.
Right.
If you go up and down, it changes the softness.
Well, the bracket, the bracket does too, but if I'm already have selected an area and that brush is sitting too large, I'm going to wipe out more than I meant to. You said, and I'm all self-taught, so.
Right. Okay. Well, this,
Mary,
Uh-huh,
another possibility, go into edit preferences
uh-huh.
and then under cursors.
I tried changing that at one time and thought I had it, and then 2 or 3 releases later, it went away. And
Well,
I just thought maybe
Is it-
someone,
Is it normal brush tip and standard?
I believe I had it on standard. Is that the problem maybe?
No, normal brush tip and standard is the default, and that's what you're probably used to. That's
Yeah.
what I'm used to.
Yeah.
that's what I have.
I know these things because I've struggled with them too.
Well, and the strange part of it is that at one point it was just exactly the way I thought it should work, and I learned it that way, and now it went away, and then I just say bad words and
Yeah, bad words have not helped me a lot.
right. Occasionally,
Make you feel better though, right?
right?
No.
Okay. Well, I just thought maybe I haven't even tried to straighten it out in a while. I just got accustomed to it. And, but I'm sure it's something I inadvertently did or something I do that they no longer like for you to do. So,
Well, what I did was, I guess I had inadvertently locked caps on,
uh-huh.
but I didn't know that's what caused it. So I went trying to fix it, and I went into preferences cursors and really hosed things up.
Well, that's why I mentioned earlier about, especially on a Mac here, I don't know if it's the same with Windows or not, but on this Mac, I made the cursor bigger so I could find it. You know, there were several of these where I was having trouble finding my cursor so that I could paint. And so I made it bigger, and it's great. I can find it real easily. But then whenever I go to paint something, like here, see how little that is inside this big circle? So it's much smaller than the actual brush that I have.
Right.
And that's because I've artificially made this brush bigger so I can see it. And so I can't paint that way. So I finally figured that out today, that it's because I went into my setup on my Mac and told it to make the cursor bigger. So now I did it today so that you guys could see my cursor a little easier, but I'm going to go change it back shortly because it makes it difficult to do any kind of adjustments.
Okay.
So I don't know, Mary, I would just suggest looking up here if you can't figure that out or something,
Yeah.
because at least that tells you what size your brush is to start with.
Yeah, and I've gotten into a habit of not paying any attention to that because, but that was just my way of doing things. So, okay, thank you.
Sorry I couldn't answer it. Anything else? Anything? Everything's rosy, huh? There are a couple of things I want to talk about eventually, and I'm going to show you a couple of things since we have a little bit of time. There's a thing in here called puppet warp that I want to talk about, which is kind of cool, and it's really used whenever you're doing compositing or something where you have elements that you're putting in. So you could use it on this right here if you needed to when you're putting something in. It's typically not used on letters like this, but basically what puppet warp allows you to do is select the element that you're on, basically the layer you're on, and then it's got a mesh that goes all around it, and you're able to move parts of it. So if I had someone, let's say I did this with a basketball player not long ago, that did one of these spread eagles where he had his arms out palming the basketball. Well, that's too wide for my banner, so I wanted to move his arms down. So I just went in and puppet warp and put an anchor on his shoulder, and it was able to pull that arm down, and it looked just as natural as anything. So that's kind of how you use puppet warp. So I wanted to kind of go over that at some point. And there's also a filter gallery I wanted to go over at some point too, which is basically where you've got all these really cool things in here. And I'm on the wrong layer, but you know, you've got different artistic things that you can do with poster edges, film grain, fresco. These are kind of really cool things, and how you can come in here and apply these to your image. This would work on landscapes as well as portraits or anything else. So this is something I'd like to talk about at some point. It's really cool. What else did I want to do? Did anybody have any request for something to talk about at some point?
We'll come up with something.
Well, think about it, because I want to talk about things that interest you and things that you know, would help you, and not just kind of do something that I think would be neat. Because it doesn't matter what I think. What matters is what helps you. And then there are some other stuff here like render flame, render trees, render clouds, and stuff like that. How to do lens flares through this render. Can talk about that. There's better ways to do it, but that's there. And stylize. You've got embossing, diffusing, extrude, all these different things in here that are really cool that we could talk about. Wind. I haven't done that one before. So if there's something that you have in mind, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm just kind of picking it myself, thinking, well, this is something maybe they can use, and throwing it out there. So
I just tried the wind today. It's neat, but it didn't do what I wanted it to do.
okay, well, cool. Maybe I'll let you teach that one then.
Oh no, I'll be student.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Miller time? or maybe Merlot time? Or
Pinot Grigio.
Pinot Grigio time, yeah. That's right. You're the whites. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'm going to say that that's it. And I hope you got something out of this. You know, if you're not getting anything out of these, please let me know and what I could change to make them better, because I'm just kind of doing it the way that I would like to learn. And I'm hoping that you're getting something out of it. And I'm sure that you're not going to just go out and be able to start doing this right away. You may need to review the video to kind of remember some of the things I talked about. But it's just going to take, you know, doing it in order to, just like anything else. So anyway.
If anybody followed along, I took the word Merry Christmas and put wind on there. It's just really cool.
There you go. All
So
right.
it works. Thanks a lot, Bob.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Bob.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
You bet.
Bye.
Bye.